So, here is where I'm going to start. I'm going to start. Lecture's a very formal word, isn't it? I mean, when I think of lecture, I think of being at university, sitting in a big hall, listening to an old professor droning on in a way that was clearly designed to put everyone to sleep. So I'm going to try not to give a lecture and actually do something that I hope will be at least reasonably interactive and an opportunity for a conversation. So my intention is to ask some questions and to hope that we will be able to have a conversation about this at the end. But I'm going to start by asking you a question, and it's easy, this one. All you need to do is put your hand up. I'm not going to ask anything more difficult than that yet. Hands up if you know who Raquel Rolnick is. Yeah, that's a relatively small but incredibly well-informed group of people. Okay, hands up if you remember that a couple of months ago there was a little bit of media frenzy over the UN Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing who came to visit the UK. Does anyone remember that? Yeah. Fascinating. Raquel Rolnick is that UN Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing. And she's a professor of land or land economy, something like that, based in Sao Paulo, in Brazil. And she came, and she looked around and talked to a number of people, of whom I was one. Very interesting woman, and we had a really interesting conversation with her. And she produced an interim report where she said, more or less, that she thought the bedroom tax should be immediately suspended and re-evaluated. And all hell broke loose. I mean, really, you would not have believed the response if you hadn't been here watching it. So, the chairman of the Conservative Party, have we got any journalists in the room? Well, bloggers and tweeters, that's fine. But the chairman of the Conservative Party, Grant Shapps, appeared on the Today programme after Raquel Rolnick had produced this interim report and said she wasn't invited by the UK government, she didn't speak to any ministers, she didn't speak to any senior civil servants, we didn't know what her programme was, and we had no idea that she was going to be doing this. She was invited by the UK government, she spoke to Eric Pickles and Don Foster, she spent 2 days with senior civil servants in CLG and DWP, and she had a CLG civil servant with her for most of her tour. Why did he say all of that? Because he didn't want to talk about the report. And actually, it created a bit of a feeding frenzy. Some of our more hysterical commentators got very wound up and agitated about this. The temerity of someone from Brazil coming here and telling us about housing policy. How very dare she? Richard Littlejohn, in one of the more acute, thoughtful, considered pieces of political commentary I've read, called her a witch. Also, because he didn't want to deal with the report, the things that were actually in the report. So I'm not going to talk about the bedroom tax at the moment, although given half a chance, I'm always happy to tell you what a disgraceful, horrible, outrageous measure I think the bedroom tax is, which is causing a huge amount of damage to a whole lot of ordinary people and should be repealed immediately. But if you want me to talk about that, please ask later on. No, what I really want to tell you about Raquel Rolnick's visit is that when you read the interim report, there was something in the preliminary remarks of that report that I thought was really, really interesting. What she said was that the UK has managed to do something quite remarkable. She said that in the main, the fact of being poor in the UK does not axiomatically mean that you live in poor housing. Now, I think someone from Brazil is actually in quite a strong position to say that. Because in Brazil, they've not managed to do that. In Brazil, if you're poor, you live in a favela, or an informal settlement, or a container lorry, or something. but you don't generally live in good housing if you're poor. And she said, this is one of the very, very few countries in the world where that is the case. And because of that, the UK has been a beacon of hope to countries around the world. And then, sting in the tail, and you're moving away from it. Having got there, having done something which internationally is quite remarkable, you're moving away from it. I agree with that. Now, I've spent far longer than I care to remember in and around housing. I started my working life with street homeless people in Glasgow. I worked for Centrepoint here in London for 9 years. I've worked for housing associations. I've done this kind of lobbying job for quite a long time now in Scotland and in England. And I know what the housing pressures are and the housing problems are. And I get deeply, deeply, not just frustrated, but angry and disappointed and sad when I see the numbers of people that we now have living in bed and breakfast, where after years and years of hard work, we nearly got rid of that. Where I see the number of people back sleeping on the streets, sleeping in doorways, where we nearly, after years and years of effort, almost got rid of that. And the government's claim that it should never be right or never necessary for people to sleep out on the streets for more than one night, that is a fantastic objective. But the measures that are in place are no longer supporting the delivery of that objective. The government said in response to the release of the figures about bed and breakfast accommodation and the big increase in the number of people living in bed and breakfast, the government said there should be absolutely no need for any local authority anywhere in the country to be using bed and breakfast. This from the government that cut capital investment in the provision of new homes through housing associations by 2/3 in the Comprehensive Spending Review of 2010. The single biggest cut anywhere in that Comprehensive Spending Review. So, I understand that we have a difficult economy. I understand what housing pressure looks like. I understand exactly what's happening in the housing market. I understand how difficult it is for people to buy. I spend my professional life providing and helping people in my organisation and elsewhere to do the real work behind all of the headlines that shows that rents are becoming completely unsupportable. That far too many people are spending half of their disposable income and more on paying for their housing costs. On the reality that people cannot afford to buy. That plenty of people in this room who might in a previous generation have expected to buy a home are almost certainly not going to be able to do so unless we get a lot more of East London Community Land Trust and the work that you're planning to do. That is the reality. That is a definition for me of a housing crisis. We don't yet have people living in favelas. We don't have slums on the edge of London. But it's a short distance from beds in sheds to that. And our face is pointing in the wrong direction. Now, I want to do some unpacking of some of this and talk a bit about how we've got to where we've got to, the good things and the less good things. And I think I'm going to go back really to the First World War. And this is a very short history lesson and it won't take long and I'll do my best not to bore you. But at the end of the First World War, about 20% of the population of the UK owned their own homes. Basically, we were a society that rented property. I mean, if you read the great authors of the 19th century, it's not just Charles Dickens talking about people renting horrible slum properties. Everyone in those books is renting their property. Jane Austen's family rented the house that they lived in. People didn't, in the main, own property, they rented it. And in after the First World War, when there was a very clear understanding that we needed to do better, there was a proper acceptance, a kind of public consensus that eventually was matched by a political consensus that we needed to invest in house building. And most of that was still rented housing. But increasingly from the 1920s onwards, it was because of investment through local authorities. And council housing was, I think, the single biggest thing to transform the housing landscape in this country. And through the 30s, then the war, and then through particularly the late 40s, the 50s, into the 60s, a huge, absolutely monumental building programme of new homes, where people were less concerned about tenure and more concerned about the need to have good quality homes. Now, it's easy to mythologise what council housing was like and what it was about. In the 1970s, the early 1970s, 20% of the top decile of income earners lived in council housing. Council housing was not designed to be housing for the poorest. It was designed to be housing for people who were in work and people who were in reasonably good jobs. The important thing about it was that it was the building of 200,000 and more new council homes a year that dealt with the fundamental underlying problem that we had of lack of supply. But by the 1960s, although we had to a significant degree dealt with that underlying problem of lack of supply, we had not solved the problems of the people who were the poorest. And anyone here who is old enough to remember Cathy Come Home and the impact that Cathy Come Home had on the whole nation, in a way that nothing will ever do in that same way again, because in those days everyone watched one television programme or the other one, and that's what people talked about the next day. Cathy Come Home came along, appeared on our screens, and it was like a smack between the eyes. The idea that this young family might be living on the streets. And it reconnected our whole nation, I think, with the idea that as a society, we did not think that was acceptable, and that we had to do something better than that. And there were a whole lot of things that we did. Through the 70s, there was still an enormous building programme. But from the mid-1960s onwards, I spent a lot of my time, and have done for the last few years, attending 40th anniversaries and now beginning to be 50th anniversaries of housing associations, because so many of the really well-known housing associations actually were born in the mid to late 1960s as a response to that knowledge and understanding that although council housing had made a huge difference, there were still a whole lot of people who were falling through the cracks. And the housing association movement at that time, some of it was about communities and local neighbourhoods, some of it was about particular customer groups and client groups. Our focus at that point was on young single people who were not getting good access to housing. It was on people who had particular support needs and care needs, or it was on particular dispossessed or poor communities. And as that work began to grow, and particularly from 1974, when the government introduced Housing Association Grant, as it then was, Social Housing Grant, there was a mechanism by which the work that local authorities had done was able to be supplemented, and some of the cracks began to be filled in. Never all of them. We never got it all right, although by the late 1970s, supply and demand were more or less in equilibrium. We didn't have a lack of supply. The important thing about all of this is that through all of that period, there was a national consensus that it was right to try to create this environment where the fact of being poor did not axiomatically mean you had to live in poor quality housing. A real, not just national consensus, but a political consensus. Elections in the 50s and 60s were fought on governments fighting each other over the size of the promise they could make about the number of new homes that would be built. And that carried on right into the 70s, and an economic collapse that happened then. Nothing like the scale of the one that we've had recently, but nonetheless enough to make people think differently. And here's where I think the narrative about our recent history begins to be a bit distorted. I think that what we tell ourselves is that as a nation we are in love with owner occupation and always have been. An Englishman's home is his castle. I don't believe that. I think we have been taught that that is a superior form of tenure. And I think we've been taught it for 2 or 3 reasons. And there are things that have made us buy into that idea, which I'll come back to. But the reasons that we were taught it were not just about Margaret Thatcher and right to buy and all about, creation of a property-owning democracy, although that struck a public chord, and actually with 70% discounts, you would have been nuts not to buy if you had the means of doing so. But what happened, I think, around the late 1970s and early 1980s, is that there was a very fundamental shift in our thinking about housing. So that in the 50s and 60s, governments would say, and we've commissioned some research about this, the manifestos of the political parties would say things like, we can think of no more important social service than housing, or housing is at least as important a social service as the health service. We do not think like that now, and the change happened then. And the change happened and was defined as housing is not a public service, it is a private good. And as soon as you say that housing is a private good, then you relocate the responsibility for delivering against that requirement from the state collectively to individuals. And that's what we did. And Right to Buy played right into that narrative that was being developed about housing being a private good. And since then, you look at the manifestos, ever since then, you talk to the politicians, you think about the way that housing has been discussed at general elections or at local elections, it is never talked of, or almost never talked of, in big strategic terms. Well, it's never talked of in strategic terms at all, which is part of the problem, but it's certainly not talked of in strategic terms as being a fundamental public service. It is defined as a private good. That worked economically for the nation at a time when they were saying we cannot afford to invest as much as we're presently investing in public services. Sound familiar? And when they started saying that, if you were also able to sell council housing under the Right to Buy, then you were creating more and more and more people who had the responsibility themselves rather than it being a collective or community good. And I've always believed that the Right to Buy was phenomenally successful for those people who were fortunate enough to be in the right place at the right time, and catastrophic in terms of the overall balance of our housing supply system. And we are dealing with the consequences of that now. And that has been exacerbated by a continuing failure to invest in housing, which has run for 30 years and more. And this is not something about it being a political football. It almost stopped being a major political issue. Again, the work that we've had commissioned actually looked at political manifestos for the last 95 years. And since the 1980s, the amount in the manifestos about housing has been tiny. And where it's been there, it's tended to be about Right to Buy or about MIRAS, and not been about major investments in new supply. And then we've created an economic strategy that has depended, absolutely depended, on a lack of supply in the market. Because what we did was create this idea that buying your house wasn't fundamentally, or certainly not just about securing somewhere safe and secure to live. It was about providing yourself with a cracking investment for the future. So think 2008 and think back 20 years before that. In France, Germany, most of Western Europe, the real increase in the value of owner-occupied homes in the market was something like 0 to 0.5% per annum. The real value. So inflation plus 0 to 0.5%. So broadly, the value of property, residential property, kept pace with other values in the economy. Not here, folks. Here, it was inflation plus 3% per annum. Which meant that the value of your property was going up in some cases, in some places, as is happening again right now, by more than the rate of your pay. I mean, this is just bonkers. But here's another interesting fact for you. 73% of British passport holders living in Britain own their own homes. And they have, if you're being economically rational, and not all of us are economically rational, I promise you, I know I'm not economically rational. But if you just think about the economics of this, those 73% have an economically rational investment in ensuring that supply is less than demand. Because the value of the commodity that they now own is going up in value once again in the way that it did before the bubble. And no one wanted to see that bubble burst. So at a point where our nation was growing economically quicker than it had ever done, and where in general terms most of us were feeling richer than we had ever done, not all of us, but most of us, we had an absolutely clear vested economic interest in ensuring that we didn't provide enough homes for everyone, because it was the apparent value increase in our homes that was underpinning the consumer boom that was making sure that everyone was going off to all these different shops and keeping the tills ticking over. So I believe that there was a direct correlation between homelessness in the late 90s and early 2000s and the increase in the apparent value of our homes, because we needed that backup to be able to sustain the consumer boom that kept the economy looking fabulous. And then it got worse. It got worse because we began thinking, we like this place, and we like it just the way it is. So we don't want people coming along and building new homes here. We certainly, absolutely don't want anyone building anything in our beautiful villages. But we don't really want anyone building anything in our towns either. You know about the debates there have been about housing density in London. So let me ask you this question. Hands up, just, a flight of fancy. Hands up if you wouldn't mind spending a few years living in Manhattan. Yeah? Do you know that the density of Manhattan is nearly 3 times the density of inner London? 3 times. But the quality of the housing and the quality of place and the quality of environment is not cheap, nasty, horrible. And actually, if you look around cities in, all kinds of different places, the density in Edinburgh and Glasgow is much greater than it is in London. The density in Paris is much greater than it is in London. The density in Berlin is much greater than it is in London. Places where people are happy to be and where we do not automatically assume that density means bad quality. Why do we assume that? Well, because we've had a bit of a history of building rubbish at high density. So we have actually equated high density with rubbish. Actually, the conversation that we need to be having is one about quality. And we've all pretty much failed on that. We have built too many rubbish boxes. We have built too many places that are being knocked down now because architecturally they didn't work. But not just architecturally, they didn't make people feel proud of where they lived. And I love going to places. I sometimes get asked to take part in openings of new developments, which is a real privilege, and I'm very honoured to be doing it. And I went to Bristol a few weeks ago to be part of a new development that wasn't just housing and a brand new library. In this environment, a brand new library, that was pretty impressive, and a whole lot of other community facilities. But it was in a part of Bristol that had a picture of itself as being pretty downtrodden. And this is a fabulous new building. It's iconic, you can see it from the motorway, and people drive by and say, wow, that looks fantastic. And we have to reconnect with this idea that by building new homes, we enhance the amenity value of the neighbourhoods and communities where we work. We don't detract from them. We make places better by investing in them. All these beautiful villages, does someone think they fell fully formed from the sky 200 years ago and then never anything happened to them? Well, actually, what's happening to a lot of them is that they're dying slowly, and they're dying slowly because people who live there won't allow the few new houses to be built that will allow young families to carry on staying there. And people say, oh no, the school's closing, the shop's closing, the pub's closing, even the church has disappeared. Why? Because there's no families and young kids here any longer, because you wouldn't allow them to build the houses. And we've got very trapped into an idea that says because we like where we are, we have some kind of justification for saying, whatever the needs of others, we're not going to have that any longer. We're just going to keep it as it is. We're going to keep it exactly as it is. Well, that won't work. It won't work anywhere. It never works. You get stagnation if you do that, and you get slow and steady decline if you do that. So what we need to be doing is thinking creatively about how we transform the future. And this, I think, is where things get really exciting. Because if you think about the way that, I'll talk for a moment about housing associations, the way that housing associations have grown and developed and, stock transfer and big new development and some doing housing for market rate and all those other things. A lot of it has been because we were able to take advantage of what the government said we could do. And that was helpful, and it was very good, but I am not any longer happy with the idea that housing associations are agents of the state. Because actually, what they have to be is organisations that are in control of their own future and their own destiny. Why? Well, because when I hear Mark Prisk, now no longer Housing Minister, you blink, you've missed another one, but when I hear him standing on the platform at the Federation's annual conference and saying to the housing association world there gathered, I think you should convert every letting you have, new development or relet, to affordable rent, and I don't understand why you're not doing it. Do I think rent setting is safe in the hands of government? No, I do not. No, I do not. And I've been around this business for long enough to remember the days when housing associations were the organisations, the fact of them to some extent, was what was challenging the orthodoxy, challenging the establishment. Well, for good or ill, housing associations are now the establishment. Housing associations own more homes in this country than local authorities do. And in the main, the transfer from local authorities to housing associations has greatly improved people's lives. There are neighbourhoods all over this country, really all over this country, which were in real dire straits, which have been transformed. Not so much because the local authority didn't want to do it, but because it didn't have the capacity and the focus that enabled it to do it. But that's not really the conversation that I want to have today. The conversation that I want to have, and to open up and see what you think about, is I think that there is, I tweeted before we started here, I have become a twit. Is that what you call it? I don't know, just in the last few weeks, and I'm working out what it's good at and what it's not good at. And for a while I was very excited. Now I think, there's a million tweets there. How on earth am I meant to read all of that? So anyway, what I tweeted was, CLTs have got a huge future role. And I believe that CLTs have got a huge future role. And I'm not saying that because I'm in this audience, standing here now. And I didn't just say it at that conference that Dave talked about that he'd come along to. Because I think any system of supply, and certainly anything that's to do with housing, to do with community participation, to do with local engagement, needs people who are challenging the orthodoxy, needs people who are coming along and biting the backside of the establishment. And that, I watched your election here. The ballot box is over there if any of you haven't finished it yet. Now, I counted, each of the 5 categories has 5 names. So I'm not sure how nail-biting the result of the election is going to be. But I tell you what, it's a pretty brutal form of community participation to make every single one of the candidates stand up in front of a public meeting and display themselves to you. There aren't many places now where that happens. And it's great that we've got organisations that are prepared to say, this is what we're going to do. But here's the rub. Here's the rub. The question for me is who is going to be given the job of defining the future. Now, we've been doing some work with housing associations and others over the last couple of years, the last couple of months, about looking to the future. We've called it Hot House. There's a very interesting website with a whole lot of good, thoughtful pieces on it. If you go to it, it's hothouse.org.uk. If you don't do .org, you might find something that you neither wanted nor expected to see. But hothouse.org.uk, and the question that we've asked members is not what do you think the world will look like in 20 years, or what do you think your organisation will look like in 20 years. The question we've been asking is, what do you want to look like in 20 years? And that question is absolutely critical, because no one's going to get the right answer. But the right thinking is about what future do I want for my organisation? What future do you want for East London CLT? What future do you want for other CLTs here? Because if we don't have our own vision of the future will still happen. And someone else will come along and populate the future with their vision of it. And we're going to get to 2015 and the general election in 2015. And after the general election, whoever is elected, they're going to sit back and think, right, we've got 5 years now, let's have a look at the books. And they're going to say, oh, good swear words all over the place. Because they're going to say, 5 years of austerity economics, 8 years after Lehman Brothers and Northern Rock. And the total amount of public debt will be greater than it was in 2010 or 2008. That's what they will inherit in 2015. Now, whatever government comes in then has 2 choices, 2 options, I think. One is a bit more of the same. So a bit more of cutting off the welfare budget, squeezing the health service, and a little bit off defence, and all the other things that we've seen. Or do something radical. I think the former is more likely, because governments are inherently cautious. But the 2015 Comprehensive Spending Review is the one moment they have to be big and radical, because they'll then have 5 years to do it. It's the one moment. I think I know, and this isn't a kind of party political comment, it's just a description. I think I know what a right-wing Tory government radical thinking looks like in this territory. It looks like, because they've told us plenty of times, it looks like the significant withdrawal of the state, a huge reduction in our understanding of the welfare state, a continuation of a public discourse that says it's not fair that we're working hard and paying for these scroungers. We'll get all of that. I don't know, and I've been talking to senior people in the Labour Party about this, I don't know what the equivalent radical thinking on the left would be if they decided to do something big and radical. But mainly what I think is, I want us to know what our radical thinking about the future is. I want us to be asking the disruptive questions. I want us to be the ones who are saying, We've got a view of the future, and we can deliver this future, and we will deliver this future, and we need you to do this and this and this to help us and to support us to deliver that future. And I think that is not just about housing associations, although housing associations are big now and capable of making quite a lot of noise and bringing quite a lot of asset to the table. But it is about the other people also in the space. Other people at a local, at a grassroots, at a community level, organisations like Community Land Trusts saying, we are the disruptive question. We're not just asking a disruptive question, we are the disruptive question. We're the ones who are saying to you, there are different ways, there are better ways, there are additional ways, but we know what we want our future to look like, and we want you to come along and support us in delivering that. So your future in the short term is absolutely about getting St Clement's going. But your future, 10 years, 20, do you know, in an ideal world, what you want your future to look like? Because it's only if you can answer that question that you can begin to put in place the steps that will allow you to get to it.